In my last lecture, I downloaded a lot of information. Today, my plan is for you to spend less time dozing to the disembodied voice and more time sharing insights with your classmates. Our focus will be comparison of works across cultures. So let's start with the last work we examined, the Niobedes Crater. Like the Last Judgment of Hunefer, this work contains a narrative of human encounters with the gods. In both cases, the gods have the final word, but otherwise the narratives are very different. How are they different, and which narrative comes closer to the narratives we encounter in our Judeo-Christian tradition? Oddly enough, since we think of ourselves as much closer to the Greeks than to the Egyptians, in moral and theological terms, we're probably more comfortable with the Egyptian narrative. The Egyptian gods dispense judgment based on human choices of right or wrong. The Greek gods display favoritism or petty vengeance. What stylistic similarities and differences do you notice? There are similarities. The figures are mostly in profile, shown in 3/4 view. The gods are somewhat higher than the mortals. This is actually more pronounced in the Greek painting. But even though both narratives include movement, only the Greek figures really seem to move through space. The unchanging world of Egyptian cosmology has given way to a more dynamic but maybe more disturbing vision. Here we see two processions, representatives bringing tribute to the king of Persia at Persepolis and Athenians bringing tribute to Athena on the Parthenon of the Acropolis. We've talked about the Panathenaic procession. You've now learned something about the Persians. The procession you see here from the staircase leading to the platform of the king's great audience hall, or Apadana, probably depicts the New Year's festival procession of representatives of 23 subject nations of the Persian Empire. Now you're about to learn more about Persepolis. For now, let's just talk about the form of these two friezes. How are they similar and different? There are actually a lot of similarities. The folds of the draperies are rendered meticulously in both works, and art historians in fact think that Persian artists were influenced by what they knew of Greek styles and Greek art. And while the Greek drapery is somewhat more realistic, it is still very straight, maybe imitating the fluting of the columns. But under that drapery, the Greeks obviously have bodies. We see clear outlines of knees and legs. The feet, likewise, are moving forward more naturally. None of the odd compositional perspective where the chest and shoulders are frontal, but the legs are moving forward in profile. I tried to blow up the faces, not entirely successfully. Again, what similarities do you see? Well, in both cases, the faces are quite serene, but it seems to me that the Greek faces are somewhat more individual and expressive. On the other hand, the Greeks' clothing is all very similar, while the figures on the Persian frieze are dressed very differently. Why? Actually, the similarity and difference in clothing takes us to the very heart of differences between these processions and between these cultures. In Persepolis, the representatives of 23 nations are bringing tribute to the Persian king. In Athens, the processors are all Athenians, although I'd note that the women, even though they are probably daughters of high-ranking families, were not allowed to be citizens. Persepolis is an empire. Greek is sort of a democracy. The Persepolis frieze celebrates the diversity of an empire, but also the total sovereignty of the king. The Greeks are celebrating themselves, as well as their goddess Athena, and even Athena, like all of the Greek pantheon, seems to be made in a rather human image. The collision between the Greek city-states and the mighty multicultural Persian Empire would shape the history of the world for centuries. Europeans and their descendants have usually celebrated the Greek victory as a triumph for humanism, for self-determination, and in some cases for democracy, although the Greek city-states were by no means all democracies, and Sparta was about as far from democratic as one could get. A reason why I really like the crash course video on the Greeks versus Persians that we assigned for last night is it gives a rather different slant to this tale. So, what was to like about the Persians? There's a lot to like, as you heard. They were religiously tolerant. They allowed subject peoples to keep their leaders and their religions as long as they did not rebel against Persian rule, and they did not keep slaves. Here you see the two College Board images from Darius's capital, Persepolis, in modern-day Iran. Below, you see an overview of the Apadana, or audience hall, and especially the huge stone pillars. Above, you see the grand staircase with its famous processional frieze that we've been looking at. I added the double-sided griffin capital, which is also for Persepolis, mostly just because I think it's cool. It is very hard to get a sense of these vast public spaces just from a photo, so let's watch a brief video from UNESCO, the United Nations' main cultural organization. Here are a few more photos of the staircase that we see only distantly in the College Board image. What messages do you think are sent by the upward movement of the tribute bearers? Well, they need to ascend to get to the level of the king, right? And what about the lion attacking the bull? Both animals that are traditional symbols of kingliness and of strength. Actually, art historians dispute the last question vigorously. One interpretation is that the lion represents the sun and the bull represents the moon, and therefore this shows day defeating night. So maybe it represents the enlightenment of Persian rule. Note how many public spaces relate in some way to movement of the heavens. It's worth thinking about why that's true. And now, believe it or not, I'm almost done talking. You'll be spending the rest of the class making comparisons among 6 public spaces, all pictured on this slide. You'll be breaking into groups where we want you to brainstorm about how the big 4, function, content, context, and form, can be used to describe the public spaces you've been assigned. You should check your workbook notes, and I've also provided some websites for a further look if you have time. Pay special attention to the kinds of processions or ceremonies that were performed in these spaces, and how the spaces accommodated and reinforced these ceremonies and the culture.